The last M14 rifle rolled off the line in Springfield, Massachusetts, on a spring day in 1968. Nobody fired a salute. Nobody gave a speech worth remembering. Workers walked out of buildings their grandfathers had entered, past machines that had produced weapons for every American war since George Washington ordered the place built. For 174 years, the Springfield Armory had been the beating heart of American military production. 14,000 workers at its peak. Millions of rifles shipped to battlefields across the globe. Then a defense secretary decided a spreadsheet mattered more than history. The gates closed. The town never recovered. This wasn't just the end of one factory. It was the beginning of the end for America's great industrial arsenals. As we dive deep into the rise and fall of this giant, I want to hear from you. Which legendary company or forgotten factory would you like to see in our next investigation? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if you want to uncover more stories of industrial empires and the fateful business decisions that changed the course of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our upcoming episodes. The story begins with a problem that most Americans have forgotten. In 1794, the United States of America was 6 years old under its current Constitution and already terrified. The Revolutionary War had ended barely a decade earlier, and the new republic had learned a brutal lesson during that conflict. American soldiers had fought with a patchwork of weapons: French muskets, captured British arms, locally forged guns of wildly inconsistent quality. There was no domestic arms industry worth the name. Every major shipment of powder and shot had depended on foreign allies, whose generosity came with strings attached that could strangle a young nation. George Washington understood this vulnerability better than anyone alive. He had watched his Continental Army nearly disintegrate not from British tactics, but from supply failures. Soldiers at Valley Forge had carried muskets with broken locks and no bayonets. Entire regiments had gone weeks without adequate ammunition. Washington had begged Congress for weapons the way a man begs for water in a desert, and Congress had responded with promises it couldn't keep because the manufacturing capacity simply didn't exist. The most powerful nation on its own continent couldn't produce enough guns to defend itself. So when Washington became president, he made arms independence a priority. In 1794, Congress authorized the establishment of two national armories, one at Harper's Ferry in Virginia and one at Springfield in Massachusetts. The choice of Springfield wasn't random. It was strategic, calculated, and rooted in geography that most people overlook. Start with the river. The Connecticut River runs through western Massachusetts with the kind of steady, powerful flow that makes engineers smile. The Mill River, a tributary, drops sharply through Springfield's terrain, creating natural water power sites that could drive machinery without expensive steam engines. Water power was the electricity of the 18th century. Without it, you couldn't run a forge, a grinding wheel, or a trip hammer. Springfield had it in abundance. Then consider the location. Springfield sits roughly 100 miles inland from the Atlantic coast. In an era when the British Royal Navy could bombard any port city at will, that distance mattered enormously. A coastal armory could be shelled, raided, or blockaded. An inland armory was protected by geography itself. The British would have to march an army through New England countryside to reach it, and the Revolutionary War had demonstrated how poorly that tended to work out for the British. There was also history. Springfield had served as a military storage depot during the Revolution. Washington himself had designated the site for weapons and ammunition storage in 1777, and a small operation had been assembling cartridges and repairing arms there throughout the war. The infrastructure was primitive, but it existed. Workers with relevant skills lived in the area. The institutional memory of wartime production, however modest, hadn't entirely faded. But here's the thing about Springfield's early history. Before the armory became a symbol of American industrial might, it was almost the place where the American experiment ended. In 1786, A year before the Constitutional Convention, a veteran named Daniel Shays led an armed rebellion of debt-crushed farmers across western Massachusetts. They were furious about taxes, about foreclosures, about a state government that seemed to serve creditors while ignoring the men who had bled for independence. Shays and his followers targeted the Springfield arsenal directly. They wanted the weapons stored there, not to fight the British, to fight their own government. Picture this: over 1,000 armed rebels marching on a federal weapons depot in a country that had won its own independence through armed rebellion just 3 years earlier. The irony was lost on nobody. The arsenal's defenders, a small militia force under General William Shepard, opened fire with artillery. The rebels scattered. 4 men died. The rebellion collapsed within weeks, but the shockwaves traveled far. Shays' rebellion terrified the founders. It demonstrated that the Articles of Confederation had created a national government too weak to protect its own military assets. A country that couldn't defend its own arsenal couldn't defend anything. The inability to mount a coordinated federal response to an armed uprising was one of the key arguments that drove delegates to Philadelphia in 1787, where they drafted the Constitution. In a very real sense, the vulnerability of the Springfield arsenal helped create the nation that would later depend on it. The place that almost ended America helped rebuild it. The armory that Washington authorized in 1794 was nothing like what it would become. Forget the massive brick buildings and precision machinery of later decades. The first Springfield Armory was a handful of wooden workshops clustered on a hill above the Connecticut River, staffed by a few dozen workers who were essentially independent craftsmen operating under loose government supervision. These men were skilled artisans, blacksmiths and woodworkers who had learned their trades through years of apprenticeship. Each one produced muskets largely by hand, forging barrels over charcoal fires, filing lock mechanisms to fit individual weapons, shaping stocks from walnut blanks, with draw knives and chisels. A master armorer might produce 20 muskets in a good year. Each weapon bore the marks of its maker's hands. Subtle variations in fit and finish that made every gun unique. This was craftsmanship in the truest sense. It was also hopelessly inadequate for a nation that kept picking fights it couldn't arm itself to win. The numbers tell the story. In its first full year of operation, the Springfield Armory produced approximately 245 muskets. The entire annual output of America's premier weapons factory wouldn't have equipped a single battalion. By 1799, with war against France looking increasingly likely, production had climbed to roughly 4,600, but only by hiring additional craftsmen and pushing them to work longer hours. There was no systematic method for increasing output beyond adding more hands and more time. Every musket was still a one-off creation. If a lock mechanism broke in the field, a soldier couldn't swap in a replacement part from another weapon. The parts didn't match. A broken musket meant a useless musket, which meant a disarmed soldier, which in wartime meant a dead man. The early superintendents struggled with problems that had nothing to do with engineering. The master armorers who staffed the factory considered themselves independent contractors, not employees. They set their own hours, worked at their own pace, and resisted any attempt to standardize their methods. They were proud men who measured their worth by the quality of individual weapons, not by production quotas. When the government tried to impose uniform specifications, the armorers pushed back. They knew their craft. They didn't need some bureaucrat in Washington telling them how to forge a barrel or file a trigger guard. This tension between craft autonomy and institutional control would define the armory for decades. It was the same tension that would eventually tear the place apart and, paradoxically, produce one of the most important manufacturing revolutions in human history. The first real crisis came with the War of 1812. When the United States declared war on Britain in June of that year, the The Springfield Armory was still producing muskets essentially the same way it had in 1795. Output had improved somewhat, reaching perhaps 10,000 weapons per year by 1810, but the methods remained rooted in craft tradition. Each musket still required extensive hand fitting. Quality varied wildly from armorer to armorer. The war exposed every weakness in the system. Troops needed weapons faster than the armory could produce them. Quality suffered as supervisors pressured craftsmen to sacrifice precision for speed. And muskets arrived at the front with ill-fitting parts and unreliable mechanisms. The very thing that made each weapon a testament to individual skill, its uniqueness, became a logistical nightmare when thousands of them needed to work reliably under identical conditions. Something had to change. The old way of making guns could not sustain a republic that kept finding itself at war. The man who changed everything arrived in 1815. His name was Roswell Lee, and he became superintendent of the Springfield Armory at a moment when the institution was teetering between two worlds. Behind it lay the craft tradition. The master armorers with their hand-filed locks and individually fitted stocks, men who answered to no one's standards but their own. Ahead lay something nobody had a name for yet, an idea so radical it would take decades to fully realize, and would eventually reshape not just gun-making, but every manufacturing industry on Earth. Roswell Lee didn't look like a revolutionary. He was a career military officer, methodical and exacting, the kind of man who believed that systems mattered more than individual brilliance. He had served during the War of 1812 and had seen firsthand what happened when weapons built by artisans met the brutal logistics of modern war. Parts that didn't interchange, muskets that couldn't be repaired in the field, quality that varied wildly from one gun to the next, depending on which armorer had built it and what kind of morning he was having. Lee arrived at Springfield with a mandate from the War Department. Make the weapons uniform. Make the parts interchangeable. Make the process predictable. The armorers hated him for it. Understand what Lee was asking these men to give up. A master armorer in 1815 was not a factory worker. He was a craftsman with years of training, a man who took pride in the fact that his muskets bore the distinctive marks of his skill. The slight differences between weapons weren't flaws. They were signatures. When the government said every trigger guard must be identical to every other trigger guard, it wasn't just changing a manufacturing process. It was attacking an identity. The armorers saw standardization as an insult to their expertise, a reduction of skilled artistry to mindless repetition. Some quit, others resisted passively, continuing to hand-fit parts while claiming compliance with the new specifications. A few sabotaged inspection efforts by producing components that looked uniform but weren't. Lee fought them with bureaucracy. He introduced written specifications for every component. He established inspection stations where gauges, not human judgment, determined whether a part met tolerances. He created a system of piece rate payment that rewarded workers for producing components that passed inspection rather than for the artistic quality of their individual work. It was a grinding, unglamorous battle, fought not on a battlefield, but on a shop floor, one specification at a time, one stubborn armorer at a time. And then Thomas Blanchard walked into the picture. Blanchard was a mechanic from Worcester, Massachusetts, a tinkerer who had been obsessed with machines since childhood. The story goes that he built his first invention at age 13, a device for counting apples as they fell into a barrel. By 18, he had designed a lathe for turning irregular shapes that caught the attention of people who mattered. In 1818, he arrived at Springfield with a device that would prove more consequential than any weapon the armory ever produced. His lathe could copy the shape of a wooden model onto a raw piece of stock. Feed it a finished gun stock as a template, and it would carve an identical copy from a blank piece of walnut, feed it another blank, and it would carve another copy, and another, and another, each one virtually identical to the original. Here's the thing about Blanchard's lathe. It didn't just speed up production, it obliterated the most time-consuming bottleneck in musket manufacturing. Shaping a gun stock by hand required hours of skilled work with draw knives, rasps, and chisels. A good stockmaker might finish 2 or 3 in a day. Blanchard's machine could produce a dozen in the same time. And each one would match the template with a precision no human hand could sustain over hundreds of repetitions. The machine didn't get tired. It didn't have bad days. It didn't resent being told to make every stock identical. Blanchard eventually developed 14 different machines for the Springfield Armory, each one designed to perform a specific shaping operation that had previously required skilled hand labor. Together they formed what he called a series of machines, a sequence in which raw material passed from one specialized device to the next, each one performing a single operation, until a finished component emerged at the end. It was, in embryonic form, the assembly line. Henry Ford gets the credit. Thomas Blanchard built the prototype. Almost nobody knows his name. The revolution Blanchard helped ignite had a name, though most Americans have never heard it. They called it the Armory Practice. Not a single invention, but a complete system of manufacturing, a philosophy that encompassed machine-driven production, division of labor, precision gauging, systematic inspection, and the relentless pursuit of interchangeable parts. Springfield didn't invent every element of this system. Eli Whitney Sr. had famously promised interchangeable parts in his musket contracts of the 1790s, though historians have largely concluded he never actually achieved them. The man was a better salesman than engineer. The French had theorized about uniformity in weapons production for decades. But Springfield was where the theory became practice, where the ideas were tested, refined, and proven at scale. Here's the kicker. The armory practice didn't stay inside the armory walls. It leaked. It radiated outward through the Connecticut River Valley like heat from a furnace, transforming every industry it touched. Machinists trained at Springfield left to start their own shops. Tool makers who had built custom equipment for the armory applied the same principles to sewing machines, clocks, bicycles, and eventually automobiles. The techniques developed to make musket parts interchangeable became the foundation of what Europeans would later call the American system of manufacturing. The approach that made the United States an industrial superpower. The irony is sharp enough to cut. Springfield trained the private manufacturers who would eventually replace it. The armory was the teacher. Kant and its students would one day make the argument that the teacher was obsolete, but that reckoning lay decades in the future. In the 1820s and 1830s, Springfield was ascendant. Production climbed steadily as new machines replaced hand operations. By the mid-1840s, the armory was producing roughly 14,000 muskets per year, with a workforce of around 250 men. The quality was more consistent than anything American manufacturing had previously achieved. Parts from different production batches could be assembled into functioning weapons without hand-fitting, a capability that military planners recognized as strategically revolutionary. The Mexican-American War in 1846 provided the first real test of this new capacity. When the United States declared war on Mexico, the War Department turned to Springfield for weapons. The armory delivered. Thousands of percussion muskets shipped south to equip the troops fighting under Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. The weapons performed reliably in the brutal conditions of the Mexican campaign, from the deserts of northern Mexico to the jungle approaches of Veracruz. Springfield had proven it could arm a war, but the war with Mexico was a skirmish compared to what was coming. Nobody at Springfield in 1848, watching muskets crate and shipped to the Rio Grande, could have imagined the scale of demand that would arrive 13 years later. The Mexican War had required thousands of weapons. The next war would require hundreds of thousands. And the armory that Roswell Lee had rebuilt and Thomas Blanchard had mechanized would face a test that would push it beyond anything its creators imagined. The machinery was ready. The system was proven. And somewhere in the South, the arguments about slavery and sovereignty were moving past the point where arguments would matter anymore. The Civil War hit Springfield like a thunderclap. When Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter in April 1861, the Armory was producing roughly 800 muskets per month. Within weeks, the War Department demanded that number multiply by a factor that would have seemed insane in peacetime. The Union Army needed weapons for hundreds of thousands of volunteers who were pouring into recruitment offices across the North. Men who showed up with enthusiasm and patriotism and absolutely nothing to fight with. Springfield was the only federal armory left. Harper's Ferry, the other national arsenal Washington had established in 1794, sat in Virginia. When Virginia seceded, Confederate forces seized it. They burned what they couldn't carry and shipped the captured machinery south to Richmond, where it would produce weapons for the rebel army. Let that sink in. The manufacturing equipment that the United States government had spent decades developing was now being used to kill United States soldiers. Springfield stood alone. The superintendent in 1861 was a man named Alexander Dyer, and the challenge he faced was staggering. He needed to increase production tenfold while maintaining the quality standards that made Springfield weapons reliable enough to trust with soldiers' lives. He needed to hire and train hundreds of new workers in a labor market that was simultaneously being drained by military enlistment. He needed to source raw materials, iron, steel, walnut, brass, in quantities that strained supply chains already disrupted by war. And he needed to do all of this immediately because men were dying. The Armory responded with a fury that reflected the national mood. Your production climbed from 800 muskets per month to over 3,000 by the end of 1861. By 1863, the factory was producing more than 20,000 weapons per month. The workforce expanded from a few hundred to over 3,400 men and women, working in shifts that kept the machinery running from dawn until well past dark. The noise inside those brick buildings became a continuous industrial roar. Hammers and lathes and drilling machines and grinding wheels all operating simultaneously, a sound so loud that workers communicated through hand signals because shouting was useless. The weapon they produced was the Springfield Model 1861, a .58 caliber rifled musket that would become the most widely used firearm of the Civil War. It was accurate to 500 yards, reliable in rain and mud, staying, and simple enough for a farm boy with 2 weeks of training to operate effectively. Over the course of the war, Springfield produced approximately 793,000 of them. Add in the variants and predecessors, the Model 1855 and the Model 1863, and the total climbs past 800,000 rifles from a single factory complex. No other facility in America came close. Here's the thing about those numbers. They represent more than industrial achievement. Each rifle was a piece of the system that Roswell Lee and Thomas Blanchard had built decades earlier, now operating at a scale its creators never imagined. The interchangeable parts, the precision gauging, the division of labor, all of it was being tested under the most extreme conditions possible. And it worked. When a soldier's rifle broke in the field, he could swap the damaged component with a part from any other Springfield musket, and the weapon would function. Quartermasters could ship crates of replacement locks, barrels, and stocks to the front, knowing they would fit whatever weapons needed repair. The logistics of arming a million-man army became manageable because Springfield had spent 40 years perfecting a manufacturing system that treated uniformity as a moral principle. But Springfield wasn't just arming the Union. It was teaching others how to arm it. The demand so vastly exceeded what one factory could produce that the government contracted with dozens of private manufacturers to build Springfield pattern weapons. Companies like Remington, Alfred Jenks and Son, Lamson Goodnow and Yale, and others received technical drawings, specifications, embryology, and in some cases direct assistance from Springfield armorers. The private contractors were building copies of Springfield's design using Springfield's methods. The armory had become the template, the standard against which all other production was measured. This was the fulfillment of something that had begun with Eli Whitney's unfulfilled promises in the 1790s. True interchangeability at industrial scale, achieved not by a single genius, but by a system refined over decades by hundreds of machinists, tool makers, and superintendents whose names most Americans have never heard. The Springfield Armory didn't just produce weapons, it produced a method. And that method would outlive every individual rifle that rolled off its production line. The private manufacturers who learned Springfield's techniques during the Civil War carried that knowledge into peacetime. They applied the principles of precision gauging, specialized machinery, and interchangeable parts to sewing machines, typewriters, bicycles, and eventually automobiles. When European industrialists visited American factories in the 1850s and 1860s, they gave what they saw a name. They called it the American System of Manufacturing. The name stuck, and it described a revolution in production that had its roots not in any private factory, but in a government armory on the Connecticut River. Samuel Colt learned from Springfield. So did Remington, Winchester, Smith & Wesson, and virtually every other American arms manufacturer of the 19th century. The irony runs deep. The government institution that pioneered American mass production trained the private companies that would eventually lobby for its closure. The teacher created its own replacements and handed them the curriculum. By 1864, the Springfield Armory was operating at peak capacity. Every building hummed. Every machine ran. The workforce had reached its Civil War maximum, and the production numbers represented the highest sustained output of any weapons factory in the Western Hemisphere. Springfield had armed the force that would preserve the Union, had supplied the rifles that would be carried at Gettysburg and Vicksburg and the Wilderness, had equipped Sherman's army for its march through Georgia. The factory had become what Washington had envisioned 70 years earlier, a national capability that no foreign supplier could threaten and no private contractor could match for reliability. Then Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The guns stopped firing, the orders stopped coming, and Springfield, like every wartime manufacturer, faced the question it had been too busy to consider. What happens when the killing stops? The answer came fast, and it came hard. Military contracts collapsed within months. The workforce that had swelled to over 3,400 began shrinking immediately. By 1866, production had fallen to a fraction of wartime levels. Skilled workers who had spent 4 years inside those buildings found themselves surplus to a peacetime army that needed almost nothing new. The government had warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with rifles. Enough to fight another war, without manufacturing a single additional weapon. The armory survived because it was a government institution, not a private company. There was no bankruptcy, no liquidation, no investors demanding their money back. The federal government simply reduced the workforce, slowed production, and kept the facility operational at minimal capacity. Workers were laid off in waves. Families that had moved to Springfield during the war boom suddenly had no income. The boarding houses that had filled with armory workers emptied out. Shops that had prospered on wartime wages saw their customers vanish. Here's the kicker. This pattern, this brutal cycle of wartime surge and peacetime collapse would repeat itself for the next 100 years. Every major conflict would bring Springfield roaring back to life. Every peace would send it into hibernation. The factory existed in a permanent state of readiness for a catastrophe it could only prosper from. It was an institution whose success was measured in other people's suffering, a tool built for emergencies that withered in their absence. The Peacetime Armory was a ghost of its wartime self, maintaining skills and machinery for a day it simultaneously dreaded and depended upon. The workers who stayed through the lean years understood this bargain intuitively. They kept the machines oiled and the skills sharp, and they waited for the next war, knowing it would come, knowing it always came, hoping it wouldn't, but knowing that when it did, Springfield would be ready. It always was. The post-Civil War armory settled into a quiet that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had worked there during the war years. The thundering production lines slowed to a murmur. Buildings that had shaken with the rhythm of 1,000 machines now housed a skeleton crew maintaining equipment that had no immediate purpose. The workforce shrank from over 3,400 to a few hundred, and even those remaining workers understood that their positions existed more as a hedge against the next crisis than as a response to any current need. The government kept Springfield open the way a nation keeps a fire station staffed in a town that rarely burns, just in case. But the lean years weren't empty years. The armorers who remained used the peacetime decades to refine their craft in ways that wartime urgency had never permitted. They experimented with new steel alloys, tested improved barrel rifling techniques, and developed breech-loading mechanisms that would make the old muzzle-loading muskets obsolete. The Springfield Model 1873, a single-shot breech-loading rifle known as the trapdoor Springfield, became the standard infantry weapon of the post-war Army. It was the gun carried by soldiers at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where Custer's men died holding weapons that could fire accurately at ranges their predecessors never dreamed of, but couldn't fire fast enough to save them from being overwhelmed. The mythology says Custer was a hero who fell against impossible odds. The reality is that 210 men carrying single-shot rifles rode into a force of nearly 2,000 warriors and discovered that rate of fire matters more than accuracy when you're surrounded. The trapdoor Springfield was a fine rifle. It just wasn't the right rifle for a massacre. The armory during these decades existed in a strange twilight. Technologically sophisticated, institutionally secure, but economically marginal. The workforce fluctuated with congressional budgets and the occasional small-scale conflict, the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War of 1898. But nothing approached Civil War demand. Springfield produced weapons in modest quantities, enough to keep the Army supplied, and the skills alive, but not enough to justify the sprawling complex of buildings that lined the hill above the Connecticut River. Now step inside those buildings and look at the people who actually made the guns. Because the story of Springfield isn't just about weapons and wars. It's about the hands that shaped the metal and the lives that revolved around the factory like planets around a sun. The armory workforce in the late 19th century was a layered community built on skill, seniority, and ethnic identity. At the top sat the master machinists and tool makers, men who had spent years mastering the precision equipment that made interchangeable parts possible. These were the aristocrats of the shop floor, workers whose knowledge of tolerances and metallurgy made them essentially irreplaceable. They earned the highest wages, held the most secure positions, and passed their skills to sons and nephews in an informal apprenticeship system that kept expertise within families for generations. They were also, almost without exception, native-born Yankees who considered the armory their birthright. Below them worked the machine operators, men who ran the lathes, milling machines, and drilling equipment that performed the repetitive operations of mass production. They needed training, but not the deep expertise of the tool makers. Their work was steady, rhythmic, and physically demanding. 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, standing at machines that vibrated through their bones and filled the air with metal dust so fine it hung in the light like fog. The dust settled on skin, in hair, in lungs. Workers coughed it up in gray-flecked sputum that they learned to ignore, because complaining changed nothing, and the alternative was unemployment. Then came the laborers, the men who hauled raw materials, swept floors, stoked furnaces, and performed the brute physical work that kept the factory functioning. Since these positions required no specialized skill and paid accordingly, they were the jobs that went to the newest arrivals, the most recent immigrants, the men who had no connections and no leverage, and took whatever was offered because the armory was hiring and they needed to eat. The immigrant waves came in succession, each one reshaping the workforce and the community around it. Irish workers arrived first, fleeing famine, and finding in Springfield a government employer that offered something private factories often didn't: relative stability. They took the hardest jobs, endured the suspicion of Yankee-born armorers who considered them crude and unreliable, and gradually established themselves in neighborhoods within walking distance of the factory gates. French Canadians followed, crossing the border from Quebec to work in the armory and the textile mills that had sprung up along the Connecticut River. Then came Poles, Italians, and Swedes, each group claiming its territory in the boarding houses and tenements that clustered around the factory. The ethnic hierarchy inside the armory mirrored the social hierarchy outside it. Yankee families held the skilled positions. Irish workers dominated the middle ranks after decades of gradual advancement. Newer immigrants started at the bottom and worked their way up over generations, if they were lucky. Foremen played favorites. Assignments reflected prejudice as much as competence. A Polish laborer with mechanical aptitude might wait years for a chance at a machine operator position that an Irish foreman's cousin received after months. Nobody called this system unfair. It was just how things worked. Picture this. A typical morning at the armory around 1890. The steam whistle blows at 6:30, and men emerge from houses on every surrounding street, walking in streams that converge at the factory gates. They wear heavy boots and cloth caps. Their lunch pails contain bread, cold meat, maybe a piece of pie wrapped in paper. They speak English, Irish accented English, French, Polish, Italian, each language clustering with its own group as the men sort themselves into departments. Inside, the machines are already warming up, belts and shafts beginning their daily rotation, powered by steam engines that consume coal by the ton. By 7 o'clock, the factory floor is a wall of sound. Metal strikes metal. Grinding wheels scream against steel. The air thickens with oil smoke and iron dust. For the next 10 hours, these men will stand at their stations performing the same operations hundreds of times, each repetition identical to the last, each one wearing down their bodies in increments too small to notice on any single day but devastating over decades. Government propaganda called them the backbone of national defense. The men themselves called it a living. Here's the thing about that living. It came with a price the government never acknowledged. The armory's injury records, where they survive, document a steady stream of crushed hands, severed fingers, and burns from hot metal. Workers who were maimed received no compensation beyond whatever charity their community could muster. A man who lost his right hand at a milling machine lost his livelihood, his independence, and his place in the factory's hierarchy in a single awful moment. He became a burden rather than a provider, dependent on family or the parish for survival. The government that employed him offered nothing. National defense apparently didn't extend to defending the people who made it possible. Women worked at the armory too, though their presence was carefully circumscribed. They performed inspection tasks, checking finished components against gauges, and assembly work that required dexterity rather than physical strength. They polished metal, packed finished weapons for shipping, and handled the lighter bench work that male supervisors deemed appropriate for female hands. They earned roughly half what men earned for comparable work, The justification was always the same tired formula. Women supplemented household income. Yet women didn't need full wages. Women should be grateful for the opportunity. The women who worked at Springfield were grateful for nothing. They knew the value of what they did. The men who supervised them rarely admitted it. The community that grew around the armory wasn't a company town in the way that Coltsville had been. The government didn't build worker housing or operate beer halls or plant ornamental deer on the grounds. But the economic dependency was just as total and in some ways more dangerous because it was invisible. Springfield's South End organized itself around the factory's rhythms. Shops opened and closed on the armory's schedule. Landlords set rents based on armory wages. Churches built their congregations from armory families. Schools educated armory children who would grow up to become armory workers themselves. And the institution wasn't just an employer. It was the gravitational center of an entire community's existence. When the armory prospered, Springfield prospered. When the armory contracted, Springfield suffered. There was no separation between the factory's fate and the city's future, and nobody seemed to find that terrifying, which was the most terrifying thing of all. The cycle turned again in 1917. When the United States entered World War I, Springfield received orders that dwarfed anything since the Civil War. The Army needed rifles, millions of them, and it needed them immediately. The armory dusted off machinery that had been idle for years, rehired workers who had drifted to other industries, and began ramping production with the desperate urgency that only a wartime government can generate. The weapon this time was the M1903 Springfield, a bolt-action rifle that had been adopted in 1903 after the Spanish-American War exposed the limitations of older designs. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, accurate to distances that would have astonished Civil War marksmen, with a smooth bolt action that allowed a trained soldier to fire 15 aimed rounds per minute. Meaning the M1903 had been produced in modest quantities during peacetime. Now Springfield needed to manufacture it by the tens of thousands. The workforce surged past 5,000. New buildings rose alongside structures that dated to Samuel Colt's era. Women entered the factory in larger numbers than ever before, filling positions vacated by men who had enlisted or been drafted. They operated machines, performed inspection work, and proved themselves capable of precision manufacturing at a level that surprised supervisors who had spent careers assuming women couldn't handle the work. When the war ended in November 1918, those women were among the first to be let go. Their competence was acknowledged privately and discarded publicly. The jobs went back to men, and the women went back to being invisible in the armory's official history. The interwar years brought the familiar contraction. Production fell. Workers were laid off. The armory settled back into its peacetime hibernation, maintaining capability without purpose. But something was different this time. Inside the quiet factory, a Canadian-born engineer named John Garand was working on a weapon that would change the course of the next war before it even started. Garand had arrived at Springfield in 1919, hired as a consulting engineer to work on automatic rifle designs. The concept was simple in theory and murderously difficult in practice. Build a rifle that uses the energy of its own firing to eject the spent cartridge and chamber a fresh one, allowing a soldier to fire multiple rounds without manually operating a bolt between each shot. Semi-automatic fire. 8 rounds as fast as you could pull the trigger, compared to the bolt action's requirement of a deliberate mechanical action between every shot. The difference in a firefight was the difference between living and dying. Garand spent the next 17 years developing his design. 17 years. Let that sink in. Almost 2 decades of testing, redesigning, testing again, arguing with Ordnance Board officers who didn't trust the mechanism, competing against rival designs from other inventors, and refining every component until the weapon met standards that seemed impossibly demanding. The rifle had to function in mud, sand, snow, and tropical humidity. It had to survive being dropped, dragged through barbed wire, and submerged in river crossings. It had to be simple enough for an 18-year-old draftee to field strip and reassemble in the dark. In 1936, the United States Army formally adopted the M1 Garand as its standard service rifle. It was the first semi-automatic rifle adopted as a standard infantry weapon by any major military power. The significance of that fact is difficult to overstate. When World War II began, American soldiers carried a weapon that could deliver aimed fire at roughly twice the rate of the bolt-action rifles carried by German, Japanese, and British infantry. General George Patton, not a man given to casual praise, called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. Whether or not that assessment was strictly accurate, it captured something true about what John Garand had built in his Springfield workshop. Then came December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, and the armory exploded back to life with a violence that matched the attack itself. The scale of World War II production at Springfield defies casual comprehension. The workforce expanded from a peacetime skeleton crew to over 14,000 workers at peak production. 14,000 people passing through the gates of a single factory complex every day, working 3 shifts around the clock 7 days a week. The armory produced M1 Garands at a rate that would have seemed hallucinatory to the armorers who had hand-filed musket locks a century and a half earlier. Over the course of the war, Springfield manufactured approximately 3.5 million M1 Garands, though not all at the Springfield facility itself. The design was licensed to Winchester and other manufacturers to meet demand that no single factory could satisfy. But Springfield was the heart of it, the original. The place where Garand's prototype had been refined into a weapon that would arm the largest military force in human history. Picture this: the factory floor in 1943. The noise is beyond description, a physical force that hits you like a wave when you walk through the doors. Hundreds of machines running simultaneously, each one performing a specific operation on a specific component: barrel boring, receiver milling, stock shaping, trigger group assembly. The air is thick with cutting oil and metal particulate. Workers wear no hearing protection. There is none to wear. They communicate through gestures, through notes scrawled on scraps of paper, through the shared understanding of people who have performed the same task so many times that words are unnecessary. Here, the heat from the machines and the bodies and the friction of metal against metal raises the temperature inside the building 20 degrees above the outside air. In summer, it's suffocating. In winter, it's the only warmth some workers feel all day. The women came back. Not reluctantly this time, but by necessity and in numbers that transformed the factory floor. By 1943, women constituted a significant portion of the workforce, operating machines that their mothers had been told they couldn't handle. They bored barrels, milled receivers, and assembled trigger mechanisms with the same precision as the men they had replaced. Some of them were better. The supervisors noticed. They noted it in production reports and inspection records, and when the war ended, they pushed the women out again. The pattern held. Wartime competence earned peacetime dismissal. Here's the thing about the human cost of that production miracle. The numbers on the shipping manifests, the millions of rifles crated and sent to North Africa, to Europe, to the Pacific, represented not just industrial capacity, but physical sacrifice from the workers who made them. The 10-hour shifts stretched to 12. The 6-day weeks became 7. Workers collapsed from exhaustion at their machines and were carried to the infirmary and replaced by the next shift before their stations had cooled. The metal dust that had plagued armory workers for a century was now being inhaled in concentrations that peacetime ventilation standards would have prohibited if peacetime ventilation standards had existed, which they largely didn't. injuries accelerated with production speed. Tired workers made mistakes. Mistakes near spinning machinery meant lost fingers, crushed hands, and occasionally worse. The armory kept producing. The war couldn't wait for safety improvements. Every rifle that shipped to the front represented a soldier who might live instead of die, and that calculation justified everything. The workers understood this. Many had sons and brothers and husbands carrying the very weapons they built. The connection between the factory floor and the battlefield was not abstract for these people. It was intimate and terrifying, and it kept them at their machines through shifts that no labor law would have permitted if anyone had been enforcing labor laws, which during wartime, nobody was. Then came August 1945. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. And in Springfield, Massachusetts, the celebration lasted about as long as it took for the first layoff notices to arrive. The war was over. The orders stopped. And 14,000 workers looked at each other across a suddenly quiet factory floor and understood exactly what was coming next. They had seen it before. Their parents had seen it before. The armory's entire history was a lesson in what happens when peace breaks out, and the lesson had never changed. The machines would slow, the gates would narrow, and the community that had built itself around the factory's rhythm would absorb the blow the way it always did, silently and without recourse, because there was no one to complain to and no alternative to accept. The post-war collapse followed the script that Springfield had been rehearsing since 1865. 14,000 workers became 10,000, then 5,000, then fewer. Buildings that had vibrated with round-the-clock production went dark. Machinery that had churned out rifles by the thousand sat idle under dust covers. The community absorbed the shock the way it always had, with quiet desperation and the thin hope that another war might bring the jobs back. The Korean War provided a brief reprieve in the early 1950s, a temporary surge in orders that put some workers back on the line and gave the armory a pulse again. But it was nothing like the World Wars. The scale was smaller, the duration shorter, the afterglow briefer. When the armistice came in 1953, Springfield settled back into its familiar peacetime crouch. The Cold War kept the armory alive, but barely. The existential standoff with the Soviet Union meant the military maintained weapons development programs even in the absence of active combat, and Springfield's engineers used this window to develop what would become the armory's final original creation. The M14 rifle was a selective fire weapon that could operate in both semi-automatic and fully automatic modes, chambered in the powerful 7.62 NATO cartridge. It was the evolutionary descendant of the M1 Garand, designed by Springfield armorers who had spent their careers refining John Garand's basic mechanism. The Army adopted the M14 in 1959, and Springfield began production with the institutional pride of a factory that had been making America's rifles for over a century and a half. But even as the M14 rolled off Springfield's production lines, the ground was shifting beneath the armory's feet. The relationship between the government and its weapons manufacturers was changing in ways that would prove fatal to Springfield's existence. Here's the thing about the M14. It was the last rifle designed and manufactured primarily by a government arsenal. Everything that came after would be created by private industry. The shift had been building for decades. During World War II, the government had contracted with dozens of private manufacturers to supplement Springfield's output. Those companies had built their own expertise, their own tooling, their own relationships with Pentagon procurement officers. They had tasted military contracts and wanted more. And they had something Springfield would never have: lobbyists. Private defense contractors operated in a political ecosystem that government arsenals couldn't navigate. They employed former military officers. They contributed to congressional campaigns. They located factories in districts represented by influential legislators. They understood that weapons procurement in post-war America was as much a political process as a technical one, and they played the game with a sophistication that a government facility run by civil servants simply couldn't match. The weapon that sealed Springfield's fate was designed not by government armorers, but by a private inventor. Eugene Stoner, an engineer at the Armalite division of Fairchild Aircraft, developed the AR-15 rifle in the late 1950s. It was a radical departure from everything Springfield had built. Where the M14 was heavy, powerful, and traditional, the AR-15 was lightweight, chambered in a smaller caliber, and constructed with aluminum and plastic components that horrified ordnance officers raised on steel and walnut. Springfield's engineers tested the AR-15 and were skeptical. The smaller cartridge lacked the long-range punch of the 7.62 NATO round. The plastic furniture seemed fragile. The direct gas impingement system struck them as unreliable compared to the M14's proven operating rod mechanism. They weren't entirely wrong about any of these concerns, but they were wrong about what mattered most. The AR-15, redesignated the M16 when adopted by the military, was cheaper to manufacture, easier to carry, and allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition for the same weight. In the jungles of Vietnam, where engagements happened at close range and ammunition expenditure was enormous, those advantages outweighed the M14's superiority at distances that rarely mattered in actual combat. The Pentagon, under Robert McNamara's systems analysis regime, saw the numbers clearly. The M16 cost less per unit, weighed less per soldier, and was produced entirely by private industry, which meant no government payroll, no civil service protections, no congressional delegations defending jobs at a federal facility. McNamara's Pentagon operated on a philosophy that treated defense spending as an optimization problem. Every dollar had to justify itself against alternatives. Every program had to survive cost-benefit analysis. And when McNamara's analysts looked at Springfield, they saw an institution that was expensive, inefficient by private sector standards, and producing a weapon the military was already replacing. The Armory's defenders argued heritage, capability, institutional knowledge, the irreplaceable value of government-owned manufacturing expertise. McNamara's people argued spreadsheets. The spreadsheets won. The closure announcement came in 1968. It was delivered with the bureaucratic precision that characterized everything McNamara touched, clean, logical, and devastating to the people it affected. The Department of Defense determined that the Springfield Armory was no longer cost-effective. Production could be handled more efficiently by private contractors. The facility would be decommissioned and its functions distributed among commercial manufacturers. The political fight was fierce, but ultimately futile. Massachusetts congressmen thundered about patriotism and tradition. Union leaders organized protests. Workers who had given decades to the Armory wrote letters to newspapers describing what the institution meant to their families and their city. Community leaders warned that closing Springfield would devastate the local economy, which it would. None of it mattered. The decision had been made at a level where congressional protests were noise and worker testimony was irrelevant. The Pentagon had determined that private industry could do what Springfield did cheaper. Whether private industry could do it better was a question nobody in authority seemed interested in asking. The Armory's workforce shrank through 1968 as operations wound down. Workers watched their departments close one by one, machines powered down for the last time, tools packed into crates, production records boxed and shipped to archives. Some workers transferred to other government facilities. Some took early retirement with pensions that would never keep pace with inflation. Some simply lost their jobs and started over in a labor market that had no particular use for the specialized skills they had spent careers developing. A man who had spent 20 years boring rifle barrels to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch discovered that this expertise translated to almost nothing outside a weapons factory. The last rifles shipped from Springfield in 1968. Workers walked out of buildings. Their fathers and grandfathers had entered. Some paused at the gates for a final look. There were no ceremonies worth remembering. No generals came to pay tribute. No president issued a statement acknowledging that 174 years of continuous government weapons manufacturing had ended. The closure was administrative, procedural, and thorough. The machines stopped, the lights went off, the gates closed, and Springfield, Massachusetts began the long process of learning what happens when the institution that defined your city for nearly 2 centuries simply ceases to exist. Springfield, after the Armory, was a city learning to live without its spine. The closure didn't destroy the local economy overnight. It did something worse. It removed the anchor that had given the city economic coherence for 174 years and left nothing in its place. The Armory had been more than Springfield's largest employer. It had been the institution around which the entire community organized its identity, its aspirations, its sense of purpose. When the factory closed, the city didn't just lose jobs. It lost the story it told about itself. The decline was measured in numbers that accumulated like debt. Property values in neighborhoods surrounding the Armory dropped steadily through the 1970s and never recovered. Businesses that had served Armory workers, the diners, the hardware stores, the tailors, the bars where machinists drank after their shifts, closed one by one as their customers vanished. Tax revenue fell as the population shrank. Young people who might have followed their parents into the Armory left Springfield for cities that still had manufacturing jobs, or for college towns where they could train for careers in industries that hadn't yet been invented. The people who stayed were disproportionately those who couldn't leave. The old, the poor, the people whose roots ran too deep to pull up even when the soil had gone barren. The environmental legacy surfaced slowly, the way buried contamination always does. A century and 3/4 of weapons manufacturing had left the Armory ground saturated with industrial residue, lead from bullet production, solvents from metal degreasing, heavy metals from the plating and finishing operations that had given Springfield rifles their distinctive blue-black sheen. The soil held poisons that nobody had thought to worry about when the factory was running, because the factory was running, and that was what mattered. Cleanup efforts began in the 1980s and continued for decades. Funded by federal appropriations that acknowledged the government's responsibility for contamination it had created, while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge its responsibility for the community it had abandoned. The Connecticut River, which had drawn Washington surveyors to this site in the 1790s because its water power could drive forges and grinding wheels, carried traces of Armory runoff for generations. The water that had powered the machines now carried evidence of what those machines had produced. Fish advisories and sediment studies documented contamination that would take decades more to fully remediate. The river kept flowing, indifferent to what had been dumped into it, carrying Springfield's industrial legacy downstream to communities that had never built a single rifle. In 1974, Congress designated the Springfield Armory a National Historic Site. The designation preserved the buildings and gave the grounds over to the National Park Service, which installed exhibits, trained rangers, and opened the doors to visitors who could walk through halls where 14,000 workers had once built the weapons that won 2 world wars. The museum houses one of the largest collections of American military firearms in the world. You can see the muskets that armed the Continental Army, the rifles that fought at Gettysburg, the M1 Garands that landed at Normandy. They sit behind glass in clean, well-lit cases, each one accompanied by a placard explaining its specifications and its place in history. It is preservation, which is a kind of death dressed up as respect. The buildings are maintained, the stories are told, the objects are displayed. But the thing itself, the living institution that employed thousands and armed millions and invented the manufacturing methods that built modern America, is gone. What remains is its corpse, which speak Bidja, lovingly embalmed and presented to tourists who will never understand what it felt like to stand at a lathe in that building and feel the machine's vibration travel through your boots and into your bones while you shaped metal that would end up in a soldier's hands on the other side of the world. So what can we learn from this? Because the story of Springfield isn't ancient history. It's a pattern that keeps repeating in different industries, in different cities, with the same devastating results. Lesson 1. War is not a business model. Springfield's entire existence was defined by the cycle of conflict and peace. Every war brought a surge of production, employment, and purpose. Every peace brought contraction, layoffs, and existential crisis. The Armory survived these cycles only because it was government-owned and therefore immune to bankruptcy. A private company with the same revenue pattern would have failed decades earlier. But survival isn't prosperity, and the community that depended on the Armory experienced every boom-bust cycle as a wound that never fully healed before the next one opened. Lesson 2. Government institutions are not immune to the forces that destroy private ones. Springfield outlasted Colt, outlasted dozens of private manufacturers, outlasted every competitor that had once seemed more dynamic and more innovative. But it couldn't outlast the political calculation that private industry could do its job cheaper. The Armory's defenders argued capability, heritage, and strategic independence. The Pentagon argued cost. Cost won. It almost always does. Lesson 3. The people who build things are not the people who decide whether to keep building them. The armorers at Springfield understood their machines, their processes, and their products at a level that no analyst in Washington could match. Their knowledge was embodied, physical, earned through decades of practice. It was also irrelevant to the decision-makers who closed the facility. The closure was decided by men who had never stood at a lathe, never breathed metal dust, never felt the satisfaction of a part machined to perfect tolerance. They made their decision based on numbers, and the numbers didn't include a line item for institutional knowledge or community survival. Lesson 4. Communities pay for decisions they don't make. When Springfield closed, the Pentagon moved on. The defense contractors who replaced it hired workers in other cities. The analysts who recommended closure collected their government salaries and retired with full pensions. But the workers and families in neighborhoods that had organized their entire lives around the Armory had nowhere to go. They couldn't relocate their houses. They couldn't transfer their skills. They couldn't file for bankruptcy protection against the economic devastation that followed. They absorbed the consequences of a decision made by people who would never feel those consequences, and they are still absorbing them today. Lesson 5. Innovation creates the tools of its own obsolescence. Springfield invented the manufacturing system that made private arms production viable. It trained the machinists who staffed private factories. It developed the techniques that private companies use to undercut government production costs. And then those private companies argued that Springfield was no longer necessary because they could do the work themselves. The Armory built its own replacements and handed them the blueprint. The teacher was fired because the students had learned the lesson too well. Walk through the Springfield Armory National Historic Site today, and you will find a quiet place. The buildings stand solid and well-maintained, their brick walls holding memories that no exhibit can fully convey. Rangers lead tours through rooms where machines once thundered. School children press their faces to glass cases and stare at rifles that are older than their great-grandparents. The grounds are peaceful in a way that would have been unimaginable to the workers who spent their lives inside these walls, surrounded by noise and dust, and the relentless rhythm of production. The Armory produced weapons for every American conflict from the Revolution to Vietnam. It invented manufacturing techniques that shaped industries far beyond firearms. It employed generations of workers who built their lives, their families, and their communities around its existence. And then it was closed by a memo from a defense secretary who believed that efficiency was more important than continuity, that cost mattered more than capability, that a spreadsheet could capture the full value of an institution that had served the nation for 174 years. The buildings remain. The weapons are preserved. The community still bears the scars. And the lessons, the ones about war dependency and institutional fragility, and the disposability of the people who do the actual work, those lessons sit right there in the exhibit cases alongside the rifles, clearly labeled, carefully explained, and consistently ignored by the people who have the power to learn from them. The Springfield Armory was the iron backbone of American wars. It bent every time peace came and straightened every time war returned. In the end, it wasn't broken by an enemy or bankrupted by the market. It was retired by its own government, quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. The backbone was removed, and the body it had supported was left to find its own way forward. Springfield is still looking,